We began this evening with Syria. Last night, in his nationally televised address, President Obama laid out his case against the use of chemical weapons. But in light of a new proposal that the regime of Bashar al-Assad hand over its stockpile to the international community, he asked Congress to delay a vote on military force. The president's message signals a dramatic pause in his efforts to convince the country that the need for a U.S. military strike must be considered. Secretary of State John Kerry will meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Thursday in Geneva to examine the Russian plan. Joining me now, Senator John McCAIN in Washington and John Dickerson of Slate Magazine and CBS News. Senator McCAIN, let me begin with this question. What did the president accomplish last night, and what did he not accomplish?
Well, I think he accomplished a very compelling narrative concerning the terrible tragedies that take place as a result of Bashar Assad's use of chemical weapons, the dead children and women and innocent civilians. I think was certainly moving to all Americans. What he didn't accomplish was to describe what the strategy and overall plan is. He didn't say that he was arguing for military action, but at the same time arguing for a pause. That's very difficult to have a understanding of carrying out both of those missions at the same time. And what I was most grieved by, and I mean grieved, not angered, but grieved, is that he didn't talk about the Free Syrian Army, which has been fighting valiantly for a couple of years against overwhelming odds of Russian weapons, Iranian weapons, 5,000 Hezbollah on the ground, use of weapons of mass destruction. And yet he told me and Lindsey Graham in the Oval Office that he supported a shift in momentum on the battlefield, which would then lead to a negotiated departure of Bashar Assad. He said 2 years ago that Bashar Assad must go. That didn't enter his statement last night, and I'm very saddened by that, because the blow to the morale of the Free Syrian Army is very significant.
Do you believe, even though the plan is not fully developed, that there is a real possibility of a compromise here in which the number one objective for the president is make sure that Bashar al-Assad did not use chemical weapons again, that objective could be achieved by this compromise and is likely to be achieved?
Well, I hope that it would, but I think it's very unlikely. I'm extremely skeptical. Already we're seeing John Kerry having to travel to Geneva to negotiate with Lavrov. Why didn't Lavrov come to New York and they sit down and work out a resolution in the Security Council? Yesterday the French had a completely reasonable proposal. Putin said it was, quote, unacceptable. And Putin has also said that the United States has to renounce the use of force, something that no great nation could agree to. So the early signs are that this is rope-a-dope. And again, this is a country that Putin has supplied with Russians tons and tons and tons of weapons and equipment for years, and now he's going to be the facilitator of their departure. It really isn't logical. I hope that it succeeds. I would support something reasonable, but frankly, I'm very, very skeptical about its success, and all we're doing is delaying and while more and more Syrians are massacred.
Okay, two questions about that. I mean, does the delay come to the advantage of Bashar al-Assad, number one, and the Syrian regime? And two, what does the president do if this plan doesn't work? Speak first to whether the delay benefits the Syrian regime.
I think that if it doesn't work, the president obviously has only one option left. And maybe he could convince members of Congress that he has exhausted every avenue. And the fact is that the only reason why there was what there was because of the threat of him using force. For example, it was only yesterday that the Syrian Air Force, Bashar Assad's Air Force, began operating again. And so if the threat of the use of force had some effect on Bashar Assad, then he can argue that if we fail, then it would be encouragement to Bashar Assad.
John?
Senator, you've had a chance to take the president's temperature in these meetings with him on his desire to punish Bashar al-Assad for the use of these chemical weapons. So that's one motivation for him. But there's also reporting, and certainly you can see it with your own eyes, that this latest agreement with Syria and Russia, whatever its shape, is a kind of last-minute kind of exit ramp for him in a policy that he's in a bit of a pickle over. What do you think his greater motivation is? Is there a rush to an agreement here that might get him out of this pickle? Or is he more interested in trying to punish the Syrian regime for using these weapons?
I'm not sure, John. I give the president the benefit of the doubt of placing the priorities of the nation's security first and only. But I don't think there's any doubt that he was in a very, very difficult position, having said that he was going to strike and then saying that he needed the approval of Congress. No president has ever done that. And by the way, getting back to his speech again, I think he did not give a argument about how this conflict has become regional, that it is destabilizing neighboring countries, that is now a proxy war of which Iran is benefiting from. And if it fails, Iran and Israel and other countries will learn the appropriate lessons. I think he should have said that.
But Senator, if the president talks about the Free Syrian Army and all those things you just discussed, wouldn't the constituents who've been telling their representatives, we don't want a slippery slope here, wouldn't they hear slippery slope in all of that? They hear the complexity, the various interests that are engaged. Sounds like a huge mess that people just don't want to be engaged in.
Yeah, but you got to tell the American people the truth, and you could also assure them that we would not have any boots on the ground. When John Kerry says that any attack would be, quote, unbelievably small, then the American people aren't the only ones that hear that. Bashar Assad does, and so do other people in the world that want us to do badly. So you've got to be straight with the American people. You can't tell one group, well, wink, wink, nod, nod, this is really going to be robust. We're not going to be pinpricks. And then on the other side say it's going to be unbelievably small and short duration, and don't worry, it's only to make Bashar Assad adhere to the chemical weapons treaty. It's hard to convince people that they're going to do things militarily for the sake of a treaty. So I think he's making a mistake.
Okay, but let me suppose the question had been for the American people, who clearly the perception is do not want to see a strike based as it has been defined for whatever reason. Suppose the president had said, my objective here is to change the regime in Syria. I believe that the Syrian Free Army are a much better answer to Syria than the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and I believe that we can deter some takeover by al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda affiliates. The American people would have bought that?
No, I think what you should have said to the American people is, look, this is an unfair fight. Tons of weapons come in from Iran and from Russia every day. These people don't have the wherewithal. What we want to do is shift the momentum so that it would lead to a negotiated settlement of Bashar's departure from Syria. And these people are engaged in an unfair fight, and they are fighting against tanks, air attacks, helicopter gunships, and they deserve our assistance without American boots on the ground. That's how I think I would have shaped the argument, not just we got its regime change. I think it's got to be carefully phrased. Your
argument is, to hear you now and to have heard you before, is that the right way to end this thing is negotiated settlement, but it will never happen until Bashar al-Assad believes he's losing.
Charlie, that's only logic. That's fundamental logic. A dictator is not going to leave his power, his position of power, unless he thinks he is going to be forced to. And by the way, a negotiated settlement would be part of that negotiations, would be securing the chemical weapons sites, which the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Council have committed to do.
Why do you seem to fear? You seem to fear the consequences of the new allies of the rebels, at whatever level they are at, the al-Qaeda affiliates, you seem not to be concerned about them, or that that can be a manageable issue.
I think it's a bigger problem every single day as extremists and jihadists flow in from not just the Arab world, but from Europe and other countries as well.
Africa.
But I know the people of Syria are moderate people. You know that, Charlie. They are moderate. They're not going to be governed by al-Nusra or al-Qaeda, a bunch of foreign fighters. And they reject extremism. And the majority still, great majority, I'd say 70%, are still the moderate Free Syrian Army people. And yes, al-Nusra and al-Qaeda are a threat. And by the way, a lot of them are spending their time trying to impose Sharia law rather than doing as much of the fighting as General Idris's forces are concerned. The Syrian National Council is legitimate, and I'm confident that the people of Syria would rally around them. Is it complicated? Is it difficult? Is it complex? All of those things. But is the status quo acceptable?
But Saudi Arabia has given them support. Turkey has given them support. I'm now talking about the rebels. I mean, they give them across the board, and probably some of that fell into the hands of people that are not friends of the United States. And others have. Are those weapons not reaching the Free Syrian Army?
Some of them are, and some of them are being vetted by the United States, and some restraints have been imposed by the United States on what types of weapons, and they have been helpful. But right now, the price of a Kalashnikov bullet for a Kalashnikov is $1. They had not, until recent days perhaps, they had not received a single weapon from the United States of America. They had received a bunch of MREs with an expiration date about a month later, but here we're talking about Kalashnikovs and the equipment they're getting does not do well against tanks or fixed-wing aircraft. They have a decided battlefield disadvantage, and it's clear that a year ago, before this injection of 5,000 Hezbollah, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and stepped up assistance from Russia and Iran, the momentum was on the side of the Free Syrian Army.
Your argument is that the only reason these kinds of weapons have not reached the Free Syrian Army is because of the Obama administration.
No, not all, Charlie. But, you know, are we going to depend on a country like Saudi Arabia or others for that? It's got to be done and orchestrated by the United States of America. Now, we've had some involvement, but it's been minimal. And it's been reported, I'm not saying it's true and I don't believe it, that there are some in the administration that want to see just the fighting continue in a stalemate because they fear who might take over afterwards. That's the most cynical approach that I could ever imagine, given the human suffering that goes on as long as this conflict goes on.
Do you believe that this compromise effort, this diplomacy that's underway, in a sense, will not work, what you have suggested? I mean, do you kind of hope that it doesn't work because it's so rife with problems and issues that it would be just better if we go ahead and support with a military strike the Free Syrian Army so that it will put Bashar al-Assad on the defensive, and then we can have a negotiated settlement?
No, Charlie, I'm willing to try anything, but let's make it in a couple of 3 or 4 days. We'll know whether they're serious or not, but I'm willing to try anything. But I also want us to repeat our commitment to supplying weapons to the Free Syrian Army. That's something the President of the United States told me and Lindsey Graham to our face, and I wish he'd have said it last night.
Why didn't he say it?
I do not know, except for this balancing act that you and I were talking about earlier, fear of disturbing the liberals who might say, oh, this is a slippery slope, and but you'd have to ask them why they didn't mention it.
Everybody knows where you are on this. When you talk to your Republican colleagues, some who have announced that they could not support before this most recent diplomatic furor, what is the reason they tell you?
One of the main reasons is, of course, is the opinion of their constituents. I mean, it's overwhelming, as you know, in opposed to any further involvement, and frankly, any involvement in Syria. The Iraq and Afghanistan, but particularly Iraq, was a searing experience for them. I don't believe a compelling case has been made by the president by saying, here's what we're trying to accomplish, and here's why we're involved, and here's the plan to do it. And so they are listening to their constituents. There may be some who just because it's President Obama and don't have confidence in him, but I think most people it's because of their constituent response.
You mentioned to me on another program on CBS this morning, early on in this, that you thought the president needed to make an address from the White House. So he has now made that address from the White House. What do you want the president to do now?
Charlie, I would have postponed it. In light of this negotiations with the Russians, I would have postponed it for a couple of days to see how this plays out. Because you can't, it's really very difficult. When you've got one message, it's tough enough to get through. But when you've got one message by saying, I want to strike and get your approval, but I want to pause while we give these negotiations a chance, it complicated his message rather significantly.
Senator McCain, thank you very much. I know it's a busy day there. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Back in a moment. Stay with us.